my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, specialized in concrete work and in particular concrete highways. He worked for a company called Lone Star Cement back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. In fact, he had a great deal to do with the design and construction of much of the highway system in South America. And he had some friends who worked for the Army Corps of Engineers who were talking about this lake project up in Connecticut. He had an interest in establishing a summer residence somewhere outside of Manhattan. Had been looking up in the Lake George area, but decided to come here to Danbury and check it out. So he bought himself a pair of hiking boots and some maps and started walking around the hills and valleys here in Danbury and New Fairfield. Found a piece of land on what is now Deer Run. Went down into the valley and found the farmer that owned the land and said to him he wanted to buy it. And the farmer looked at him and said, "What do you want to do that for? You got to be crazy. You can't do any farming up on the hill there." It was a very steep piece of land with a cliff right in the middle. And my grandfather said, "Well, I'm a hunter." And the farmer believed him, and so he sold him the land. I think it was late 1926. By 1927, they had announced that they were going to do this project. I think it took them a couple of years to finish the project and fill the lake, but by 1929 or 1930, he had himself waterfront property. I had another grandfather, of course, my paternal grandfather, my father's father, Albert Clear Sr. We called him Pops, and he had worked on Wall Street for many years back in the 20s and 30s and early 40s, I guess it was. He eventually bought the property that was known as the Lake Marine Base. That must have been in the early 40s, before the end of the war. And then my father came back from the war, and he worked for Pops for, I think, a year or two at the Marine Base. One day, must have been in 46, they got a call from a woman, my mother, that she wanted her sailboat delivered. She had a Nimblet sailboat that was kept at the base. So my father volunteered to take the boat over, and when he got to the property at 17 Deer Run, where my mother was spending the summer, she was up on the porch, and he thought she looked kind of cute. And he said, I'll put it on the dock and I'll come up and tell you a little bit about how to use it. Well, she knew how to use the boat. She didn't want to hear from this yahoo. So she said, no, just leave it down there. Well, he ignored her and went up, and they chatted for a few minutes and obviously met. And he asked her on a date, and they went out on a date. And a couple of years later, in August 1947, they were married. I was born in March of 1950. I came to that house, 17 Deer Run, in July of 1950, so when I was 4 months old. And I had come to that house every summer since then until 2020, the year of the pandemic. Life was a little simpler back in the 50s and 60s. Coming here was a dream. My folks never lived here 12 months a year. Most of their lives, including when my brother and I were growing up, they lived in different parts of Connecticut. There was a Boy Scout camp up at the end of the lake, Camp Weehoo. When I was 12 or 13, and I started going to Weehoo. Initially it was just a week, and then it was 2 weeks, and I think I got up to 3 or 4. But then the routine that developed was we'd go from there to the lake, and then we'd spend the rest of the time there. So how could you not, look forward to coming? I didn't spend all that much time with my paternal grandfather, with Pops. He ran the base, and that was a business, and when he was down there, he was doing business. But I actually got to know my paternal grandmother fairly well. Her name was Nana. She was a huge football fan, and in particular, she loved the New York Jets. And even more in particular, she loved Joe Namath. So every Sunday, she would usually serve lunch, and then we'd watch the New York Jets. And then in my junior year of high school, I met 3 fellas who also ran cross country with me on the high school cross country team. We started coming down on weekends on our own. There's a small guest house at the cottage called the poop deck. That's a marine term for a part on top of the boat. And we'd sleep there, and we took full advantage of the lake for a number of years there while we were in high school. In fact, I'm still in touch with the 3. We have Zoom calls every Sunday morning. When I came to my senior year in high school, I really had no clue what I wanted to do. I'll be honest, much to my amazement, I got in Dartmouth. I don't think I could get in there now. I started with an intent of majoring in math, but I realized I didn't really like math that much. It wasn't like I wanted to teach math. So I switched and I started to develop an interest in economics. Probably even more important than that were some of the other things I did while I was there. I developed a strong interest in the outing club. I participated in what was called Woodsman's Weekend. And we, along with, 8 or 10 other schools, would compete usually twice a year in the fall and spring in wood chopping and sawing and canoeing and that sort of stuff. Well, my senior year, I was the captain of the team, although I don't look much like a lumberjack, but I was pretty good at some of the skill events, and went to the end of the meet planning, and in particular, talking about where the next meet would be held the following spring. They said, we need a volunteer to run the event in the spring of '72. My friend Thomas raises his hand, he goes, we'll run it, Dartmouth will run it. Now, we hadn't run it in probably 10 years. We had no experience, knew nothing about it. I looked at Thomas and I said, Thomas, who the heck is going to run it? You're going to graduate in a few weeks. Who's going to run this event? He looked at me and says, you are. So in my senior year, I spent most of the year studying, researching, planning for, and eventually running a Woodsman's Weekend event in Hanover. It was a huge success. It was one of the more meaningful and certainly more fun things I ever did. It's the first thing that showed me that I had some real leadership capability. I graduated in June of '72. Kind of the same experience I had at the end of high school. Really didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be a doctor. I didn't want to be a lawyer. Dartmouth has a business school right on campus, the Amos Tuck School. I was able to get in, graduated in June of '74 with an MBA. I figured, well, I don't really know much about business, so I'll do something where I'm exposed to different types of businesses, different sizes of businesses, different industries. So I went into public accounting and joined Arthur Anderson & Company and worked in public accounting for 3 years from '74 to '77. One of my friends from high school, Bill, lived in New Britain, Connecticut, not too far from where I had grown up. One weekend, he invited me to come up and spend the weekend with him and his wife. Unbeknownst to me, when we left to play squash, Bill left a note on his kitchen table for his wife, Debbie, saying, Jeff is in town, he could use a date tonight. Margie and Deb were good friends, and Margie had gone over to her place to do her laundry. Bill and I came back to the house just as she was reading the note. I walked in and I looked at her, and Bill had told me he'd left the note. And so I said to Margie, I understand you're my date tonight. I guess she liked my straightforward approach or whatever, but she decided that we would go out to dinner. That was February of '78. We dated for a year and a half, and then eventually were married in November of '79. Allison was born in October of 1980. We were still living in Manhattan at that point, although shortly thereafter we moved to Chappaqua. In 1982, I got a great job offer up in the Boston area. We moved to a town called Westford. Our son Michael was born in March of '83. And we ended up living in Westford for 28 years, almost 30 years. When we moved to Westford, I became the controller of the largest chemical division of W.R. Grace. I eventually left Grace and worked for 3 different high-tech companies. In 1986, took a company called T-Cell Sciences public. Worked there until 1992, at which point I had an even better opportunity to join a company called Microtouch Systems, make touchscreens for computers. And we were the hottest trading stock on NASDAQ in the summer of 1994. Took that company public later that year. And then 3M had decided that they wanted to get into the touchscreen business. So they ended up buying us for a very nice price. Again, changed jobs, joined a company called iRobot. iRobot, appropriately, made robots. 2003, we introduced our first really successful robot, which is still successful, the Roomba vacuum cleaner. We took the company public in 2005, a very successful public offering. And then after 10 years or so with all the companies I was with, I got a little anxious, wanted to do something different. So this company contacted me from Charleston, South Carolina, a company called Arborgen. Said they needed a CFO and they wanted to go public. I took the job. And we lived in Charleston, South Carolina for 3 years. And then left in early 2012. So I've been retired a little over 10 years. What makes Candlewood Isle special is the people. I mean, the lake and the isle and the property we own, et cetera, are all gorgeous, and we love to come here and spend the time here. But it's really the people that make it special. In 1954, my grandfather decided that he wanted a little bit more year-round house. What we call the cottage, 17 Deer Run, is a summer residence. You don't want to be there in the wintertime. So he bought a house that's where we're sitting now. This house has been redone recently, but he bought it in 1954. And he lived here until, I think it was 71 when he passed. But I feel particularly nostalgic about the house on Deer Run. That's where I spent most of my summers for 35 years. We brought Allie here that first summer. She was, 7, 8 months old when she came here. And she also has spent, various periods of time from days to weeks here ever since she was born. And then her brother, Michael, came along and did the same. They both went to the camp for several years, learned how to water ski. We did tubing. My dad was big into sailing, and he would take us all sailing. The thing I'm most proud about is that Margie and I were able to have 2 children, raise 2 children, and that they've turned out to be such wonderful people. To be part of not 1, but 2 families that have had, well, in one case, a 100-year experience here on the Isle, in the other case, about an 80-year experience. To be part of that legacy is something I'm forever grateful for. And now seeing my grandkids here has been special. Eli and Lucas both went to the camp this summer. They were there for about 6 weeks. Also this past summer, Ada got to see the island for the first time. And knowing that they love the place, that's wonderful news for me. The tradition, if you will, the legacy continues.